Today, in modern Italy, a couple can live together without ever marrying. A woman can decide when or if she has children, and same-sex couples can legally register their partnership in front of a judge. All of this feels completely normal now. Nobody blinks twice. But just a few decades ago, some of these exact same choices were illegal, scandalous, or treated as a direct threat to public morality. A woman who left an abusive husband could be blamed by the courts for the breakdown of her marriage. A man who killed his wife or daughter for honor could receive a dramatically reduced sentence, simply because the law itself excused his rage as understandable. A rapist could walk free from prison if he agreed to marry his victim. So what actually happened between then and now? Was it religion losing its grip? Was it war, feminism, television, or the internet? Our age and gender didn't just change, it was completely transformed, law after law, protest after protest, generation after generation. This is the story of Italian sexuality from 1861 to 2026. And trust me, the middle of this story is far more shocking than the beginning. Let's go back to 1861, the year Italy was unified into a single kingdom for the very first time. Before this, the Italian peninsula was a patchwork of kingdoms, papal territories, and independent duchies, each with its own local customs. But almost everywhere, one institution towered above all others when it came to sexuality and family life: the Catholic Church. In this earliest era, sexuality was never treated as a private, personal matter. It was treated as a matter of family honor, religious duty, and public social order. Marriage itself was rarely about romantic love. It was an economic and social contract, frequently arranged by parents to combine land, wealth, or social standing. A daughter's virginity before marriage was treated almost like a family asset, something to be protected at all costs, because a family's entire reputation in the village could rise or fall based on a single rumor whispered at the market. Gender roles were rigid and clearly publicly defined. Men were expected to be the providers and the public face of the household, while women were expected to manage the home, raise the children, and remain modest, quiet, and obedient. A woman's entire identity was often built around being a wife and a mother and nothing else. Stepping outside of that role, for instance, remaining unmarried by personal choice, could bring genuine shame not just on her, but on her entire extended family. Shockingly, this law stayed on the official books until 1981. Think about that for a moment. Less than 50 years ago, marrying your own victim could legally erase a sexual assault charge in Italy. Birth control was also heavily restricted by the state. Under Mussolini's fascist regime in the 1920s and 1930s, the government actively banned the sale and public advertisement of contraceptives, viewing large families as essential to national strength, labor supply, and future military power. Women who deliberately chose to have fewer children were viewed almost as unpatriotic, even disloyal to the nation. It wasn't until 1971 that Italy's constitutional court finally struck down the old fascist-era ban on contraception advertising. And only in 1978 did Italy fully legalize abortion, through the landmark Law 194, following years of intense feminist activism and street protest. Same-sex relationships existed throughout this entire period, of course, but they were forced into almost total invisibility. Homosexual acts were never explicitly criminalized under Italian national law in the same direct way as in Britain or Germany, but social and institutional persecution remained severe. During the fascist era, in particular, gay men were frequently sent into internal exile, a punishment known as confino, on remote islands, often without ever being formally charged with any specific crime at all. Silence, isolation, and shame were the real punishment. Government policy throughout most of this era treated the family, meaning a legally married, heterosexual, reproducing family, as the fundamental unit the state needed to protect and control. The sexual autonomy of any individual person barely factored into the law at all, but laws are only half of the story. What people actually did behind closed doors tells a much messier, much more human tale. Of course, official laws and public morality never tell us the whole story. Behind closed doors, real human behavior was always far messier, far more contradictory, and far more interesting than any law book could ever capture. Dating culture, in the modern sense that we know it today, simply did not exist. Courtship in rural areas was heavily supervised from beginning to end. Young couples were almost never left alone together unsupervised. A chaperone, usually an older female relative, would accompany a young woman on every single meeting with a potential suitor. In the growing cities, things were slightly more relaxed, especially among the emerging middle class, where young people had a little more freedom to meet in public spaces like cafes, theaters, or evening promenades along the main street. Public opinion demanded strict propriety at all times, yet hidden realities told a very different story behind the curtains. Historians have carefully documented widespread infidelity among married men, quietly tolerated by society as long as it remained discreet and didn't publicly threaten the family's outward reputation. Prostitution, remarkably, was completely legal and directly regulated by the state in Italy from 1860 all the way until 1958, when the famous Merlin Law finally closed all state-run brothels for good. The state openly saw regulated prostitution as a practical way to manage male sexual desire while still protecting the so-called purity of respectable women, a deeply hypocritical system that placed nearly the entire burden of public sexual morality on women alone. There was also a striking, often uncomfortable gap between elite and common experience. Wealthy, educated Italians living in cities like Milan, Turin, and Rome were often exposed to more liberal European ideas, French literature, early psychoanalysis, emerging feminist writing, and some elite circles quietly embraced far more open attitudes towards sex and relationships long before ordinary working people ever had access to the same freedoms. Meanwhile, in poorer rural regions, especially across the South, traditional honor codes remained extremely powerful well into the 20th century, and a public scandal could still ruin an entire family's standing in the community overnight. Diaries, private letters, and court records from this period reveal a hidden world that official history books rarely mention. Secret courtships conducted through passed notes, whispered arrangements between servants acting as go-betweens, and quiet affairs carried out under the very noses of watchful families. Even priests occasionally noted, with some frustration, that confessions revealed far more sexual activity outside marriage than public reputation ever suggested. The gap between what society claimed to believe and what people actually did was often enormous. And yet, beneath all of this rigid control, pressure was quietly building. Something eventually had to give. Now we arrive at the single most important part of this entire story, the moment everything truly began to change, permanently and irreversibly. The Industrial Revolution had already begun reshaping Italian society decades earlier, pulling people out of small, tightly controlled villages and into growing anonymous cities, where individual freedom quietly expanded in ways village life had never allowed. But the real earthquake arrived in the 1960s and 1970s, when several massive forces collided all at once. First came the broader sexual revolution sweeping across Europe and North America, driven heavily by the birth control pill, which finally became available to Italian women starting in the 1960s, though its sale remained initially restricted and deeply controversial. For the very first time in Italian history, women could reliably separate sex from pregnancy, giving them unprecedented control over their own bodies, careers, and futures. At the very same time, Italy experienced an extraordinarily powerful feminist movement. Women began organizing, marching in the streets, and demanding real legal equality in ways that had simply never happened before at this scale in the country's history. This grassroots activism directly produced two landmark laws: the legalization of divorce in 1970, courageously confirmed by a national public referendum in 1974 despite fierce organized opposition from the church, and the legalization of abortion in 1978. Then in 1975, Italian family law itself was completely rewritten from the ground up. The old system, which had given husbands sweeping legal authority over their wives, was finally abolished entirely. For the very first time, spouses were declared fully equal legal partners within marriage, with equal rights over their children and shared marital property. This period also saw a dramatic decline in the Catholic Church's direct grip on personal, private law. While Italy remained a deeply Catholic country culturally, its legal system increasingly separated itself from strict religious doctrine. The 1978 abortion referendum and the 1974 divorce referendum both revealed something remarkable. When given a direct democratic vote, the majority of ordinary Italians actually supported far more personal freedom than the church desperately wanted them to have. But the turning point wasn't finished yet. Not even close. Global forces, feminism, the pill, television, rising prosperity, combined explosively with local Italian activism to permanently shatter the old system of church and family-controlled sexuality. And once that particular dam broke, there was truly no going back. Because once the law changed, the media was about to change everything else. If new laws quietly opened the legal door, it was the media that dramatically pulled ordinary Italians through it. Italian cinema in the post-war decades became internationally famous, and often internationally scandalous, for its bold, unflinching depiction of sexuality on screen. Directors explored desire, infidelity, and once forbidden relationships in ways that genuinely shocked conservative audiences abroad, but also gradually normalized conversations at home that had once been completely unspeakable. Many Italian films of this era were censored or outright banned, which, ironically, only made the wider public more curious about exactly what they depicted. Television arrived in Italian homes throughout the 1950s and expanded incredibly rapidly, And by the 1980s, Italian TV had become genuinely notorious across Europe for extremely liberal programming, including private channels that broadcast overtly sexual content during regular daytime and evening hours, something almost unthinkable in the country's earlier church-dominated decades. Music also played a quiet but powerful role in this shift. Popular Italian songs increasingly explored romantic and sexual themes far more openly, gradually moving away from the coded, modest language that had defined earlier generations of songwriters. Magazines dedicated to fashion, relationships, and modern lifestyle absolutely exploded in popularity from the 1960s onward, giving ordinary Italian women direct, private access to information about their own bodies, contraception, and relationships that previous generations had simply never been allowed to have. Then came the internet, and after that, everything accelerated at a genuinely dizzying pace. Suddenly, young Italians had instant access to global perspectives on sexuality, relationships, and gender identity that completely bypassed the church, the extended family, and even the national television networks entirely. Information that once required a trusted family doctor or an extremely brave, awkward conversation became available instantly, privately, and anonymously. Social media pushed this transformation even further, allowing Italians, especially younger generations, to openly discuss identity, relationships, and sexuality in public online forums, building entire communities and support networks that simply could not have existed even a single generation earlier. And finally, dating apps transformed courtship itself almost beyond recognition. The old system of chaperoned meetings and carefully arranged family introductions gave way almost overnight to a world where individuals could meet, choose, and reject potential partners entirely on their own personal terms, based on their own private preferences, without a single family member ever being involved in the process at all. Media had done in 50 years what centuries of quiet social pressure never could. So where does all of this dramatic history actually leave Italy today? Current attitudes toward sex and relationships are dramatically more liberal now than they were even 50 short years ago. Premarital sex, once a genuine source of deep personal shame, is now widely accepted as completely normal by the overwhelming majority of Italians, particularly across the more secular north and in major urban centers. Marriage trends have shifted enormously over just a few decades. Fewer Italians are choosing to marry at all, and those who do marry are doing so noticeably later in life than their parents or grandparents did. Cohabitation without marriage, once socially unthinkable and even scandalous, is now extremely common, especially among younger couples who increasingly see it as a natural first step before, or often entirely instead of, a formal legal marriage. Dating culture today looks almost completely unrecognizable compared to just a century ago. Apps and online platforms now dominate how young Italians actually meet one another, and the old chaperone system has essentially disappeared altogether, replaced by a strong cultural emphasis on individual choice and personal emotional compatibility. LGBTQ+ rights have advanced significantly over the past 2 decades, though the overall pace has been noticeably slower than in some neighboring European countries. In 2016, Italy finally legalized civil unions for same-sex couples, a genuine legal milestone, though full marriage equality has still not yet been achieved at the national level. Public attitudes, especially among younger generations, have shifted very strongly toward acceptance, even as older generations and certain conservative political and religious groups remain noticeably more resistant to further change. Birth rates, meanwhile, have collapsed to some of the lowest levels found anywhere in the entire world. Italy now consistently records one of Europe's lowest fertility rates, a demographic trend closely linked to persistent economic uncertainty, competing career priorities, sky-high housing costs, and the simple modern reality that having children is now treated as a deeply personal choice, rather than an automatic, unquestioned social expectation. Public opinion overall reflects a country genuinely caught in transition, broadly progressive on personal freedom and individual choice, yet still visibly shaped by lingering Catholic cultural influence, sharp regional divides between the more liberal North and the more traditional South, and ongoing, sometimes heated political debate over family policy, LGBTQ+ rights, and reproductive law. But if the past 60 years brought this much change, what could possibly come next? So what actually comes next for Italy? If the last 160 years were shaped by industrialization, feminism, and the rise of the internet, the coming decades may well be shaped by something entirely new: artificial intelligence. AI-powered companionship and fully virtual relationships are already emerging as a genuine, measurable phenomenon among younger, increasingly isolated populations around the world, and Italy is very unlikely to remain immune to this global trend. As traditional dating becomes noticeably harder for many young people, weighed down by economic pressure, demanding careers and steadily shrinking social circles, AI companions and virtual relationship platforms may increasingly fill an emotional gap that used to be filled naturally by community, extended family, or traditional arranged courtship. Demographic changes will almost certainly continue reshaping the entire country in the years ahead. With one of the oldest populations anywhere in the world and one of the very lowest birth rates, Italy now faces a genuine deepening demographic crisis. Future governments may respond by introducing even stronger financial incentives for childbirth, dramatically reshaping national immigration policy, or simply watching further shifts unfold in what an Italian family even looks like, including a continued rise in single-person households and entirely non-traditional family structures. Predictions for the future generally point toward continued individualization, even more personal choice in romantic relationships, further legal expansion of LGBTQ+ rights, quite possibly including full national marriage equality within the coming years, and a continued deepening blending of technology into even the most intimate corners of private life. At the same time, there is very likely to be ongoing cultural tension for years to come, a constant push and pull between Italy's deep, centuries-old Catholic heritage and its increasingly secular, individualistic, modern national identity. Some sociologists even predict that Italy's regional divide will deepen rather than disappear. Northern cities may drift ever closer to the secular, individualistic norms already common across Northern Europe, while parts of the South and smaller rural towns may continue holding on to older, family-centered traditions for another generation or more. Whatever happens, one thing seems certain. The pace of change itself is only accelerating, not slowing down. The next chapter of this story, in other words, hasn't been written yet. Let's compare where Italy actually started with exactly where it stands today. In 1861, marriage was fundamentally a family contract. Divorce simply did not exist. Contraception was completely banned by law, and a woman's entire worth was tied directly to her chastity and quiet obedience. Today, in 2026, Italians cohabit freely without shame, divorce legally whenever they choose, decide independently if and when to have children, and increasingly accept relationships of every kind, including same-sex partnerships now formally recognized under national law. This enormous transformation didn't happen in one single dramatic moment. It happened slowly, through decades of quiet personal defiance, brave organized activism, hard-fought legal battles, and unstoppable technological change that no single government could ever fully control. Each new generation pushed the boundary a little further than the one that came directly before it. So here's the real question I want to leave you with today. Do you honestly think this enormous change made Italian society better overall? Freer, fairer, and more honest about basic human nature? Or do you think something genuinely important was quietly lost along the way? The deep sense of family, lifelong commitment, and tight-knit community that once held absolutely everything together? Either way, one thing is certain. The story of Italian sexuality is really the story of Italy itself. Its wars, its politics, its faith, and its endless struggle between tradition and freedom. Let me know exactly what you honestly think about all this in the comments section down below right now.